Okay, so we all know that weather forecasts don't always seem 100% correct. Now, why would we not be able to predict or forecast the weather? Um, well, one reason is with that numerical modeling that we do, the the models in the computer, the programs in the computer um, that we use for modeling, they don't necessarily mimic what the atmosphere is going to do. Another thing is that there is uncertainty in each one of those initial conditions. Again, this will go back to numerical weather forecasting, but there's uncertainty in all of the things, all the information we feed the computer to come up with a forecast. For instance, I mentioned temperature there. If you have a thermometer that measures a temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and if its tolerance, what we call its tolerance, is plus or minus 2 degrees, there's a lot of play in that number. And the other thing is that if we are feeding initial information or initial conditions to our computer, maybe we don't have a complete, maybe we have holes in our data. Maybe we can't get all the information we'd like to get. For instance, vertically speaking, with regard to vertical profile. Or maybe we can't get information out there in the middle of the desert, that sort of thing. So we have holes. So those are just some reasons. With a little bit of sarcasm, we can kind of say that with regard to a forecaster's job, we wish we had those jobs because the weather forecasters don't have to be right, and yet they get to keep their job. With regard to how well they do, we could sometimes talk about what we call the forecast skill. And the forecast skill is evaluating a weather forecast compared to a forecast that somebody could come up with just using climatological data. So, for instance, we've talked about climatological forecasting, and an example along those lines is predicting, like the slide says, predicting the daily high temperature for southeast Iowa in the middle of December will be cooler than 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that shows very little skill. It might be very what we call accurate, but it shows very little skill. So forecast skill is your ability to predict the weather better than you could just using general climatological data. Forecast quality is not necessarily numerically how close you were to what the conditions actually were, but just generally how well did you predict the weather. Forecast accuracy involves numeric data. Forecast bias is if a forecast model or a weather forecaster is always on one side. For instance, if temperature can be predicted relatively accurately, but if the weather is always predicted warmer than it actually ends up being, then that would be a bias, and that indicates that there's something wrong with the kind of the forecast model or the forecast system that's in place. So we talked about long-range forecasts, and I'm going to kind of talk you through with regard to forecasts. There's a very short-range forecast, medium-range forecasts, and long-range forecasts. When we're talking about very short-range forecasts, we're talking within the next 12 hours, predicting what the weather's going to be. And this can generally be done with a fair bit of accuracy. Notice, though, that these short-lived weather events like thunderstorms are still hard to predict, even in a very short-range forecast. I think meteorologists are trying to even get better at that. But short-range forecasts then would be from 12 hours to a few days out. Now, with each increasing the time for these forecasts, the less accurate they generally are. range forecasts are looking a few days up to about 14. Like the slide says, with medium range forecasts, we definitely need to look at the conditions around the world, and generally we'll use numerical modeling. Extended range forecasts then are 2 weeks and beyond. And actually that pushes generally our skill. Generally the current skill level beyond 8 days is relatively limited. But that's not to mean that we don't go ahead and try to put the pieces together and to predict atmospheric conditions with some success. We talked kind of about the long-range forecasts before with regard to monthly and seasonal forecasts.